6 verses. That's all Genesis gives him. A name, a city, a title, a mighty hunter, and then the text moves on and never mentions him again. But here's the strange part. For the next 3,000 years, the rest of the ancient world doesn't move on. From the marshes of Sumer to the temples of Egypt, to the theaters of Greece, the same figure keeps showing up. A hunter, a bull, a strongman-king, a god who dies and comes back. Different languages, different names, the same silhouette. So who was Nimrod really? And why does it seem like everyone remembered him but the Bible? Last time we stood at the tower, the ziggurat on the plain of Shinar, the machine built to bring a god down on the city's terms. And we said the languages scattered and the 70 nations spread out across the earth. But we left one question deliberately open. Somebody organized all of that. Somebody laid the first bricks, drew the first borders, wore the first crown. Genesis names him in a single breath, tucked into a genealogy most readers skim right past. And the moment you slow down and actually read it, the whole ancient world starts to look different. Through this lens, Genesis chapter 10 verses 8 and 9, a forgotten name in a genealogy, turns out to be the fingerprint the whole ancient world was left holding. Start with the name itself, Nimrod. Now, scholars are careful here, and so are we. That may be a bit of ancient wordplay rather than a strict etymology, but the ancient audience would have heard it, the way you hear a pun before you can explain it. The rebel, it's the same word used back in Genesis 6 for the mighty men of old, the men of renown. The text isn't calling him tall, it's calling him powerful, the first man after the flood to gather that kind of power into one pair of hands. And that phrase has puzzled readers for centuries because it cuts two ways. Is before the Lord a blessing, a hunter under heaven's eye, or is it defiance, a hunter in God's face? The Hebrew leaves the door open, and honestly the ambiguity may be the point. But here's what the original audience would have heard that we tend to miss. In Mesopotamia, kingship split into two roles. There was the ensi, the priest-king, who managed the temple and the gods, and there was the lugal, literally the big man, the warrior king who ruled by force and by the hunt. A mighty hunter isn't a hobby, it's a job title. Genesis is telling us exactly what kind of king Nimrod was, the first lugal, the first strongman. And then Genesis does something a myth wouldn't bother to do. It gives us his postcode. Then it says he went north and built Nineveh. These aren't dreamlike cities floating in legend. Erech is Uruk, a real place you can walk today in southern Iraq, one of the first true cities humanity ever built. And Uruk had a famous king, remembered in the oldest story we possess, Gilgamesh. 2/3 god, 1/3 man, a mighty builder, a restless hunter. Hold that name in one hand, because we're about to put the Bible's forgotten king next to the world's oldest legend and watch what happens. So let's finally look at him. Not the giant of legend, we'll get to that. The man Genesis actually describes, and notice who Genesis says he is, a son of Cush, which is why many have long pictured Nimrod as an African king, from the line that settled toward Nubia. His kingdom, though, is pure Mesopotamia. The text gives us his father and his cities, and leaves his face to us. So picture the first generations after the flood, a scattered, frightened people, rebuilding under an empty sky. And into that vacuum steps one man with a bow, a crown, and a plan. He doesn't wait to be called, he builds the first cities, raises the first standing power. And, if the tower belongs to his reign, as the text seems to suggest, he pours that power into one monument designed to reach the heavens and make a name that would never be forgotten. And that's the thing to see clearly. By force, by stone, by fear. Remember that phrase, let us make a name. Because one chapter later, God will answer the whole idea of Nimrod, not with a bigger army, but by walking up to a quiet nomad named Abram and simply giving him a name. Now follow what happens next, because this is the hinge of the whole episode. The languages fracture, the families split, and the 70 nations of Genesis 10 fan out across the earth, north into Anatolia, west toward the sea, south into Africa, and eventually to places Genesis never names. But here's what they carry with them, not a blank slate, a memory. Every clan that walked out of Shinar walked out with the same stories already in their bones. A great flood, a lost paradise, a first city, and a first king, a hunter, a builder, a mighty man who reached for heaven. Scatter one memory across 70 languages, let it drift for 1,000 years, and what do you get? You get 70 names. In Uruk, they remembered him as Gilgamesh, the hunter king, part divine, who built the walls and went searching for the secret of eternal life. In Sumer, Dumuzi. In Accad, Tammuz, the shepherd king who dies and is mourned and returns. Travel to Egypt, and the same shape has a new name, Osiris, the king who is killed, scattered in pieces and raised again. In Canaan, Baal and Melkart. In Greece, Adonis, who dies and comes back with the seasons, and Dionysus, torn apart and reborn. Bacchus in Rome. Different tongues, different costumes, but look at the pattern underneath. A mighty hunter or shepherd, often a bull or crowned with horns, a builder of cities, and again and again and again a king who dies and rises. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is where people go off the rails. So let me say plainly what this does and does not mean. There's a loud version of this idea that says all these gods literally are Nimrod, one man secretly worshipped under 70 masks, a hidden conspiracy running through all of history. And we're not saying that. That claim reaches far past anything the evidence can carry. Here's the quieter and honestly more interesting version. When a single people splits and scatters, they don't invent their gods from nothing. They carry fragments of real events, real ancestors, a real founder figure, and those fragments drift and blur and take on local color over centuries. So the resemblance isn't a secret code, it's a family resemblance. 70 cultures all remembering imperfectly something that actually happened in one valley. What the original audience would have understood is that these weren't 70 rival gods. They were 70 broken echoes of one true story and one very real king. Let's pull on one thread of that echo, because it's the one that matters most. Over and over, in culture after culture, the founder god doesn't just rule, he dies and he comes back. Osiris, murdered and dismembered, reassembled by grief, made king of the dead. Tammuz, mourned by the women at the temple gate every year until he returns. Dionysus, torn to pieces and reborn. Adonis dying with the summer and rising in the spring. It's everywhere. And for a long time, skeptics have pointed at this and said, see, resurrection is just recycled mythology. The Bible borrowed it, but sit with the pattern a moment longer, because there's a reading that turns that objection completely inside out. And it isn't only the death and return. Watch the iconography travel. The hunter with the bow, you'll find him from the reliefs of Assyria to the constellation the Greeks called Orion, the mighty hunter fixed in the sky. The bull, the horns of power, crowning kings and gods from the Euphrates to the Nile to the Aegean. The great builder king who walls a city and defies death. These aren't random overlaps. Cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years kept dressing their greatest figure in the same three costumes. The hunter, the bull, the king who would not stay dead. That's not what coincidence looks like. That's what a shared memory looks like, seen through 70 different windows. So what actually hangs on this? Two ways of seeing it, and they lead to very different places. One says, the world's religions are a random scatter of unrelated inventions, and the Bible is just one more tribe's mythology in the pile. The other says, the world's religions are a scattered family, all of them carrying warped fragments of things that really happened. A flood, a fall, a founder, a promise. And the Bible is the branch that kept the memory clearest, tracing it back to its source instead of dressing it in local myth. You don't have to prove which is true from a single carving. But notice what the second reading does. It doesn't make every religion equally right. It makes every religion an echo of something or someone they were all half remembering, and that changes what you go looking for. Now, I promised we'd deal with the giant, because if you've heard of Nimrod at all lately, you've probably heard he was a 12-foot giant, empowered by magic garments stolen from Eden, who built the tower as a working stargate and was finally beheaded by Esau at 215 years old. So, where does all that come from? Not from Genesis. Genesis says gibbor, mighty one. But when the Hebrew was translated into Greek in the Septuagint, gibbor became gigas, giant. And a whole later tradition, especially a medieval Hebrew book called Jasher, ran with it. The magical garments, the stargate, the showdown with Abram, the beheading. Here's the honest Bible lens position. Jasher is fascinating. It's genuinely old cultural memory, and it's worth reading. But despite the biblical-sounding name, it is not Iron Age scripture, it's medieval legend. So we hold it the way you'd hold a beloved family story that's grown in the telling, with affection and with a raised eyebrow. The text itself is quieter and stranger and enough. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Genesis chapter 10, verses 8 and 9. 6 verses, 1 valley, 70 names. It's easy to read past a genealogy and feel like nothing's there, but sometimes the shortest passages are the ones holding the most, a single dropped stone whose ripples reached every shore. Nimrod got his name, the way he wanted it. The whole world remembered him. He just never got to choose how. So come back to that objection. Resurrection is just recycled myth. Here's the reading that turns it inside out. What if all those dying and rising gods weren't the original? What if they were the echoes, 70 scattered peoples, each holding a broken shard of a promise made all the way back in Eden, that one day a son would come who would break death itself? The fragments came first, yes, but a fragment isn't the source. A fragment is the evidence that there was a source. And then, at one fixed point in real history, not in the misty age of legend, but under a named Roman governor, in a known town, with witnesses, a king actually died and actually rose. I am the resurrection and the life, he said. Not a myth that recurs with the seasons. A man in a garden on a Sunday morning once. Every culture had been straining to remember something real. In him, the broken echo finally became the true sound. Here's where it all comes together. Nimrod built a tower to make a name that would reach the heavens, and he got 70 names, scattered and blurred across a world that half forgot him. No tower, no army, just a promise. And that name, Abraham, is spoken today in more languages with more reverence than Nimrod's ever was. That's the quiet joke running underneath the whole story. The name you seize by force, the world remembers wrong. The name you receive as a gift, the world remembers forever. Ancient wisdom, modern clarity, one valley, and the two different ways a name can last. That nomad under the stars is where we go next. Because God's answer to the age of Nimrod wasn't a bigger empire, it was one family, one promise, and a long walk into a land he'd never seen. But the world of Nimrod doesn't just vanish. Its kings are still out there, still building, still hunting. And one day in a valley near Sodom, an old man with 300 servants will go to war against them. How does a shepherd defeat an empire? That's where we're headed next month. From here on, one deep dive a month, the whole Bible in order, taking the time each story deserves. Subscribe, and I'll see you at the beginning of it.